Everest, the world's tallest mountain. Over 29,000 feet high, the ultimate challenge to all really serious mountaineers. It stood unclimbed until 1953, when an unknown beekeeper stepped onto its summit and became the most famous New Zealander of all, Sir Edmund Hillary.
Everest might not have been conquered if Hillary's mum and dad hadn't scraped together the money to send young Ed on a school trip here, Mount Ruapehu in New Zealand's North Island. This is where he first trod on snow. This is where his love of mountains was born.
My father was something of a taskmaster, and here I was at 16 going on a trip when I really didn't have to do anything at all, and I could just enjoy myself. And I think I probably was the first time in my life that I'd been able to just enjoy myself, have an adventure, mixed with other friendly young people. It was a great experience.
The very first mountain Hillary climbed right to the top was this one, Mount Ollivier in the South Island. Here, Sir Ed relives that memorable day with his son Peter.
Even now, some 40 years later, I can still remember the intense pleasure of that day, the exhilaration of the ascent, and what a thrill it was when I finally reached the summit. It was certainly one of the happiest days of my life.
20-year-old Ed Hillary sat here spellbound, surrounded by great peaks. They looked so huge and challenging that he resolved to climb them someday. There would be adventures aplenty for the young climber. That summit was the first of many for Sir Ed, and always it seemed the higher the mountain, the greater was its attraction, and the greater the pleasure in fighting his way to the top. So inevitably, the highest peaks of all beckoned him. The Himalayas, the rooftop of the world, a mountaineer's mecca. Nepal opened its borders to foreign climbers in 1950, and the young Hillary became a regular visitor, climbing peaks over 20,000 feet high along the border with Tibet. On one early visit here, he walked through the hill country in the height of the harvest season. It was throbbing with Sherpa music and laughter. He was sure it was the loveliest place he had ever seen. But Everest, the highest mountain of all, remained hostile, defeating all attempts on its 29,000-foot summit. Hillary was determined to get there and went on 2 British exploratory trips up the mountain. The Swiss did the best in 1952, getting to within 1,000 feet of the top before being forced back.
53, the British realised that it was really then or never. The Swiss were getting fairly close to the top of Everest and getting relatively serious. The British really decided that this was the last chance. But Hunt was the tactician, the army man who was going to get them up.
Colonel John Hunt was determined to conquer Everest. His elaborate British expedition included 27 Sherpas. 2 New Zealanders, George Lowe and Ed Hillary, were invited to join it.
I think New Zealanders at that time were very good at that kind of mountaineering because they were used to carrying big loads and used to really roughing it in awful conditions. And I don't think the English were really very good at that sort of thing. I mean, you had to be tough and you had to be enormously strong, and both Ed and Tenzing were, you know, both those things.
The size and complexity of Hunt's plan paid off. By late May, a large stock of food, equipment and vital oxygen had been based at 26,000 feet. It was time for the final push. On May 26th, 2 Englishmen, Evans and Bordelon, set out for the top. Tenzing and Hillary watched anxiously, and at 1 p.m. the climbers disappeared over the south summit. They were higher than men had ever climbed before. Hillary's delight at their success was tempered with secret thoughts of envy and fear. The Englishmen were hidden by cloud. Could they climb the remaining 328 feet and be first to the very top? Hillary's companion, Tenzing Norgay, thought they would. He felt bitter that a Sherpa had not been given the opportunity to get there with the first party. At 4:30 p.m, Evans and Bordelon were back. Absolutely exhausted, they had turned around at the south summit. 28,700 feet was as high as they got. Now, Hillary and Tenzing would get their chance. Early on the morning of May 29th, after thawing their boots out over a Primus stove, Hillary and Tenzing started out on their attempt to be the first men to climb Everest. The summit was 1,100 feet above them.
At quite an early stage, I started building up a friendship with Tenzing, who was also an extremely fit and active mover. When we actually got to the South Summit, after having struggled up through this deep snow, I think I really felt then that our chances of getting along the final narrow, steep ridge to the top were pretty good, but we still weren't there. We were still had a long way to go, and I think we were always very much aware of this. Anyway, along we went, and halfway along was what we had always known would be one of the major problems on the climb, and this was a rock step, about 40 feet high. And when we got up to the bottom of it, I looked up it and thought that at this altitude of 29,000 feet, that it might well be impossible for us to climb it direct. But then I noticed on the right was a narrow crack where the ice on the east face of the mountain was breaking away from the rock. And it was a crack that was just large enough to sort of crawl inside. So I wriggled inside it and then wriggled and jammed my way up this crack and finally out onto the top of the actual rock step. And then as I lay there panting, for the first time I was really convinced we were going to get to the top. A half hour of quite hard work along sort of the backside of the ridge, and finally looking up and seeing a little rounded snow dome above us, and then up that, and we were there. I did not have a great feeling of tremendous excitement and exhilaration. Tenzing, I think, was more affected than I was, really, because I, in sort of rather square Anglo-Saxon fashion, I put out my hand to shake him by the hand, but that wasn't good enough for him. He threw his arms around my shoulders, and I threw my arms around his shoulders, and we had a good little hug on top of the mountain. And there's no doubt at all that for him, that particular moment was one of great excitement and exhilaration.
Two unknowns, a beekeeper from South Auckland and a Nepalese Sherpa, stood where no man had stood before. They literally had the world at their feet. Their lives would never be the same again. As they stood on the summit of Everest, they had little idea of what they would soon return to. Their colleagues had to wait until the pair climbed down to learn of their success. Fellow countryman George Lowe heard the news delivered in typical Kiwi style.
I was just talking to my mountaineering friend George Lowe. I wasn't expecting this to be sent out to all the world. And I said, well, George, we knocked the bastard off.
The rest of the world received the news in a more dignified style.
This is the BBC Home Service. Here is the news. Mount Everest has been conquered by members of the British expedition.
Hillary and Tenzing were that late 20th century phenomenon, instant international celebrities. Before long, the reluctant hero from Tuakau had been chauffeur-driven to Buckingham Palace to become a Knight Commander of the British Empire.
Sir Edmund Percival Hillary, the first man to arise to the top of the world's highest mountain. But how do you top that? By doing something very Kiwi. By driving a converted farm tractor right across Antarctica to the South Pole.
The place? Antarctica in the mid-1950s. The adventure? To drive almost 2,000 miles right across it via the South Pole. The last great journey in the world, the newspapers described it. It was the dream of British explorer Dr. Vivian Fuchs. He built a base on one side of the Antarctic, then in purpose-built snowcats headed south for the pole and on to meet up with the Kiwis. Hillary established New Zealand's Scott Base on the other side of the Antarctic, then drove 3 simple farm tractors inland, establishing petrol dumps as he went. Fuchs did not want the Kiwis to reach the pole. They were to wait for him some 500 miles short of it. That was the plan, but how would these converted tractors perform in the bitter and hostile conditions?
And would the man who'd conquered Everest be happy to sit amongst a few petrol drums in the middle of nowhere while the English drove to the pole and glory?
Our tractors were essentially a farm tractor. I suppose one of the main attributes that our tractors had was the fact that they were absolutely marvellous in discovering all the crevasses as you travelled along. And the first way we would discover crevasses frequently was by driving over them with our tractors, and then the big back wheels, the weight would come on and boom, down they'd break through the crust over the crevasse, and you'd lean forward, give all the throttle you could, and if all went well, you'd claw your way out the other side. So we did this a lot of times, but I must say I don't think we ever got entirely happy with it. I think the big advantage really was that you didn't need really complicated methods of maintenance. If something went wrong, you sort of gave them a kick in the guts and away they went, sort of business, just as the farmer does on a farm.
After 2 whole months of this, all at temperatures well below freezing, the New Zealanders achieved their official goal. They established their last petrol dump at Depot 500, 700 miles from Scott Base and 500 miles from the pole. In England and New Zealand, newspapers speculated, would they race on and beat Fuchs to the pole? As well as supplies, Hillary received 2 messages from the organising committee. The men in London finally told him not to proceed any further. And what of Fuchs? The news was bad. He was making slow progress. Hillary began to doubt that the English would make it at all. But if the Kiwis went any further inland, they would really be out on their own, beyond the range of their aircraft. Hillary agonised. Should he risk everything and push on to the pole? Or should he obey orders and stay put?
I'm not very good at accepting orders anyway, but I mean, I didn't really get an order from Fuchs until I was halfway from our final depot, Depot 500, and the pole itself. And it would have meant, if we'd stayed there, as he suggested, that we'd have sat around and away out in the middle of beyond, not really knowing whether Fuchs was ever going to arrive at all. And that didn't appeal to me. I was much more inclined to carry on and to get to the pole. I felt that was the only alternative that was reasonable. Anyhow, I wanted to go to the pole, so it seemed a good idea to do it.
For another 16 days, the Kiwis battled south across snow that was far too soft and crevasses that were far too numerous. On January 4th, 1958, they reached the South Pole with 20 gallons of petrol to spare, enough for just 12 more miles. The group Hillary called the Old Firm, Sir Ed himself, Murray Ellis, Jim Bates, Peter Mulgrew and Derek Wright had somehow got 3 converted farm tractors to the pole. Fuchs and his snowcats arrived over 2 weeks later. Jet boats. More Kiwi even than tractors. What better vehicles to have another great adventure in? No rudder or propeller. They steer by pumping a jet of water out the back and can speed through shallows only inches deep. In 1977, Sir Edmund Hillary and a group of good friends set out to motor 3 of these boats all the way up the sacred Indian River Ganges and into Nepal, where no boats had ever gone.
I think it was some sort of dream that Ed had had for a long time, you know, the idea of going all the way up a river from the ocean and finishing up on the top of a mountain. It was quite an appealing sort of idea, and I think when he suddenly realised that he could do it in an indigenous New Zealand machine, the jet boat, then it really struck on.
The mighty Ganges River is sacred to all Hindus who believe it to be the source of life. All devout Hindus want at least once in their lifetime to make a pilgrimage right up this river and into the Himalayas, where the gods live and supply the snow that feeds the Ganges. Carrying holy prayer flags with them to raise on the highest peaks, the New Zealanders were in a real sense on one such pilgrimage. Hillary did not know it then, but this experience of the essential India would serve him well in future official duties. What he did know for sure was that soon he and his boats would be severely tested. How far up the river could they get? The locals, most of whom had never seen a boat before, were as interested as he to find out.
Ed always felt that we would finish the jet boat part of the trip when we lost a boat. John managed to virtually sink his boat twice. On both occasions we managed to rescue the thing, get it to the side, pump it out, change the oil and start again. But we were getting to a point in the river where the writing was on the wall. We were definitely going to sink one sooner or later.
Finally, the river won. There was no way for the boats to climb this 10-foot wall of water. They had come 1,600 miles up the Ganges and into Nepal. From here, Hillary and his men would have to climb on foot to where the gods live. Had it been a practical experiment or just another damn good adventure?
I would have said it was just another good adventure. Doing something that doesn't necessarily financially profit you, and meeting challenges and overcoming dangerous situations, I personally think is well worthwhile.
From the river, the party climbed too rapidly to 18,000 feet. Hillary became ill with altitude sickness. Near to death, he had to be carried off the mountain. But a Hillary would complete the pilgrimage. Peter Hillary and his friends scaled the unclimbed Akash Prabat and planted the holy prayer flag. The gods had been honoured, the mission accomplished.
He'd conquered Everest and won the race to the South Pole. He'd driven jet boats from the ocean to the sky. Ed Hillary was always ready to take on a good challenge and win.
And he was always willing to take time out and give something back to his Sherpa friends. That story is next on Magic Kiwis.
Everest had given Ed Hillary adventure, fame and great mana, but he began to wonder, how could he give something back to the people who had helped him reach the top?
One day, camped high up on a Himalayan glacier, he asked an old Sherpa friend, how could he help?
And he said, the one thing I feel that you have that we do not have is education. And he said, what we would like would be a school in Kumjung, so that our children could get education. And then they will be just as good as you are.
In 1961, Sir Edmund raised the money, assembled the team and built the Sherpas a school at Kumjung. It was the first of many.
The schools have enabled the Sherpas to turn the social and economic changes of the last 20 years to their own advantage. The Sherpas now run their own hotels, trekking organisations and businesses. And education has also given them an increased say in their future through local and central government. There are lots of bright young Sherpas around now who'll be able to do a lot of good for their community. The climb of Everest was obviously the physical high point of my life, but I wouldn't say it's the most satisfying thing I've ever done. I see it more as a stepping stone to more satisfying projects, particularly this work here in Nepal. It's quite exciting to watch a school rise up from its foundations and to see the rock I used to climb being fashioned into schoolhouse walls. And it's good to be able to repay the Sherpas in this small way for all the pleasure they and their mountains have given me.
For nearly 30 years, Sir Edmund has raised money and returned here to build 20-odd schools, 2 hospitals, several medical clinics and a couple of airfields. The value of all this to the Sherpas is reflected by the esteem in which they hold him. Draping the odd scarf or two around the neck is a local way of showing respect.
I don't think I'll ever quite get used to these welcomes. Coming back here is always a moving experience anyway. This was the first school I built and the inspiration for the others. And it's also the school I'm most proud of. It's really good to be in the company of so many old friends and to share their pride in the achievements of their children and grandchildren. I always feel a slight degree of apprehension about get-togethers like these. Any Sherpa gathering tends to become a somewhat festive occasion, with the local beer and spirits flowing rather freely, and mostly in my direction. And it's really quite a challenge to survive these functions in an upright position. But it's worth the risk, just to be in the company of so many good friends.
Someone else willing to take a risk over friendship was new Prime Minister David Lange. He wanted to re-establish a diplomatic post in India and Nepal. What better man for the task than Sir Ed? The job offer came as a complete surprise.
But it did immediately have some appeal. I knew that if any other diplomatic post had been offered to me, I would have turned it down straight away, because I just didn't think I was particularly suitable for diplomatic activity. But India was different. I really felt that I had a warm affection for the people, and that they knew who I was, and maybe I could do a reasonable job.
Before long, Ambassador Ed was representing and defending our interests in India, Bangladesh and Nepal. This was as near to a regular office job as Edmund Hillary has ever got. More a man of action than of protocol, he is welcomed by those who stand and serve, and those who rule. Ed Hillary is the sort of Kiwi we like to be proud of. He's a man we all remember fondly.
The masses will remember Ed as the first person to get to the top of Everest. The Sherpas will remember him as someone who gave them schools and hospitals, health, education. I'll remember Ed as someone who had an enormous amount of common sense.
Sir Edmund Hillary, our own bold, bloody-minded magic Kiwi.